I think in general, the sort of call for let's not get overwhelmed by emotions and let's not concentrate on declarations is a very wise one. And I think it's absolutely right that we have to concentrate on the action. However, the action changes depending on how we interpret what happened over the last 2 days. Now, one interpretation is, maybe this US administration doesn't quite like us very much. And maybe if we act by spending more on defense and all the rest of it, we can somehow rekindle US interest and perhaps even US affection for Europe, including Ukraine. And that, of course, is the best case scenario. But shouldn't we consider that there is another scenario out there in which there is absolutely nothing that we can do to rekindle that love and affection and interest, and that therefore we are alone, and maybe we are alone facing a US administration that deliberately wants to weaken and divide us? And what is the action that we should be pursuing in that worst case scenario?
Thank you, Natalie. Contributing columnist for Politico, so thank you very much. What can we do to rekindle the love and affection for Europe that America traditionally has had for us?
Well, first of all, I agree with Natalie and everyone. And I don't say this only because I'm Finnish, but I think in Europe we need to talk less and do more. We need to continue talking in this panel as well. But the way in which we Finns in these kinds of situations react is cool, calm, and collected. And what we do first is we take an ice bath, right? And after that we go into the sauna. And then we sit there and reflect, okay, what should we do about this? Because I do feel that, the Munich Security Conference, which is my favorite conference out of all, this has been a cacophony of diplomacy, the sort of people being quite het up and shocked and the rest of it. But once we get over, as the Prime Minister of Iceland said, from this shock, what do we need to do? We need to listen what the Americans are saying. Number one, take more responsibility of your own. And I think this is a clear message, and everyone has gotten that. And if that's the case, number two, what do we do in order for that to take place? I think there's right now a lot of reflection going on, how we can, hike up our defense, how we can be stronger individually. And then number three, think about ways in which Europe can give value added to the United States. And one thing I, want to say quite clearly, don't underestimate Trump as a negotiator. I genuinely believe that Putin is baffled and afraid what might be coming from there. So in that sense, it's a good backstop. And right now, the ball is in our court here in Europe. We need to convince the Americans where is the value added and then get back into the table. If I may just throw out one idea loosely. If there is a negotiating table, I think we need to do something similar that was done in Kosovo. Europe needs to have a special envoy, like Martti Ahtisaari, and then a deputy envoy who is on the level of either Kellogg, Vitskov, Yermak, or Ushkov. And in that sense, we get some kind of a skin in the game. I see that there is a Weimar plus summit tomorrow, and that's good that Europeans are talking, and I certainly believe that the United Kingdom and non-EU members need to be a part of it. But I also think, as an avid pro-European, that it would be quite useful for the EU to have some kind of a common stand.
Just very quickly, it's Sunday morning, and I start to feel like we are in the panel of psychiatrists. We're trying to calm down emotions, trying to tell that we are not as bad and we are doing as good as we can. But unfortunately, that's the problem that I noted already at the opening remarks, that indeed what we are all the time trying to do, and probably that's a little bit of the European culture, that we try to reflect all the time. We try to talk, we try to find the perfect solution where probably there are not going to be any perfect solutions. We, in the European Union, actually are very much process-oriented, less results-oriented. And this time, this is coming back to some extent. Look how many times we have been talking that we need to be serious about defense. One thing that probably went unnoticed on Friday, but I think it was a very important announcement by the President of the European Commission about the deficit rules being, let's say, lifted or liberalized when it comes to defense spending. It was long overdue at both levels, at the national and also European. Now, of course, we will need to generate that money. You can, of course, raise deficit levels, but still you need money. Then we all know about defense industry. We all know that Europe is lagging behind in many fields: technology, artificial intelligence. US currently invests, we regulate, all those things that we are talking all the time. But where I do believe, but we need probably to end looking at our relationship with the United States. It's, as you described, it's not love and hate relationship. Most probably we have to get into the transactional mode. We need to understand that this is changing. And if we are strong, if we have something to offer, and here I agree with Alex, then we are going to be interesting to the United States. If we are just continue having those nice conferences, talking and whining, then we are not going to be interesting to our own publics very soon. And that's the problem today. But again, I very much agree. We are talking what we should do more. We continue talking. Now, probably, hopefully, in a year's time, we are going to talk about the first results, hopefully.
You sound a little bit like the Vice President of the United States. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Oleksiy Goncharenko, member of the Parliament of Ukraine. And my question is, I address to European leaders. It's really the moment of truth. Definitely for Ukraine, it's about our life, but also for Europe. Because if this crisis, if this war will be resolved without European role, it means that Europe as a geopolitical player does not exist. That's all. And I think this is the moment just to be present. And for this, I want to see Europe taking initiative. Not waiting for what will be said from the United States of America, but saying our own position, European position, how it should be, openly and clear, and definitely act. I agree with President Stubb. So my question is, and my address is, seize Russian assets now. Not freeze, not all this talking. That's in the hands of Europe. That's something you can do right now, not wait any minute more. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Maybe ask Prime Ministers to, what do you think about seizing Russian assets?
I think it's something that needs to be seriously talked about now. If you think about, as Stubb was saying, for Ukraine coming into this from a position of strength, we need to have Ukraine as strong as they can be in these negotiations, and this needs to be seriously considered. I also want to agree with what's being said here, that Europe needs to take the initiative. And if I just piggyback off of the initial question, I mean, I have 2 points here. The first thing is, we still need clarity about what the U.S. is saying and what it is expecting. I feel like we're debating things in public that maybe should be discussed in some cases between actors than in the press. I'm not saying this shouldn't be an open discussion. Don't misunderstand me. But there's a lot of hot air. There's a lot of, thinking about things that are unsure. And I think we need to come out of these next few days with some more active clarity about what the U.S. is actually saying. That doesn't mean that Europe has to wait, and hold its breath until the U.S. says something. But let's just, make sure we're reacting to the right things. But then I also want to say, I feel it's easy to become very negative towards this relationship between the U.S. and Europe. I think it's, not to speak poorly about the press, but it's negative news drives things, right? People want a negative spin. Listen, you can have a relationship with an ally that changes over time. It doesn't always have to be the same thing. And we're pretending like this is a new thing. Discussions about security in Europe have been taking place for a long time. There is a trigger now. Can we agree this might be an uncomfortable setting, especially because the sovereignty of the country is involved? Yes. But that doesn't mean relations with the U.S. have to be bad. They have to be strong. most of these countries that we're talking about are in NATO with the US. So I see there are also opportunities from this difficult, extremely difficult position when it comes to relations with the US. But on Ukraine, I completely agree. There needs to be a strong one message, as Zelensky said, from Europe, that Europe is standing with Ukraine. This is why Europe needs to be at the table to support Ukraine and in the aftermath of ceasefire. But obviously, Ukraine needs to be at the table.
I'd like to give Wolfgang Ischinger the microphone.
Thanks. I think this is a great panel. I like President Stubb. I've been struck and fascinated by the American idea which you just outlined. Assuming a ceasefire, what if Russia violates the ceasefire, and then the NATO membership thing as a deterrent? Like in so many other negotiating scenarios, seems to me the devil may be in the detail. Let's assume that kind of scenario presents itself. Russia surely will want to say it's the fault of the Ukrainians. They attacked us overnight and we had to defend ourselves. And then I bet you, Alexander, there will be one NATO member or two or three who will say, we're not ready to vote in favor of membership because we have no parliamentary majority in favor of that. In other words, my question to you is, are you sure we're going to be able to present this as a credible deterrent? I think it's a great idea, but can we do it?
Thanks. And first of all, if I may just personally also, Wolfgang, congratulate you. I mean, what you've done and your whole team has done here for the Munich Security Conference is simply remarkable. This original idea of what I would call de facto NATO membership, but not de jure membership, is an idea that has been floated by first American senators and now the administration. So I take that idea very seriously and as a good possibility. As you said, the devil lies in the detail, but as a deterrent as such, if there would be an automatic NATO membership for Ukraine if Russia were to attack after a peace agreement, I think that's a very strong deterrent in this particular situation, and I find that idea quite appealing.
I'll give the microphone here.
Follow the Wolfgang. My name is Tobias Elwood, a former foreign minister from the United Kingdom, and I want to follow on from Natalie's point because I was astonished to listen to the Vice President's speech yesterday. I represent the constituency for 20 years of Bournemouth East, jolly old Bournemouth, south of in the UK. I was astonished to hear of an incident mentioned in the Vice President's speech about that abortion clinic. And that's the concern I have. In that abortion clinic, that individual was pleaded with for an hour and a half to say, please leave. There's a dispersion order around this clinic here because of previous disruptions. Please leave, please leave. And he refused to leave. He wanted to be arrested. And yet it ended up in the Vice President's speech here at the Munich Security Conference. So when we ask ourselves, what direction is America going to go? And I say this as a dual national who was born in New York. I am deeply concerned that the mood here is so different from the many, many years that we've been here before, that a void is developing between where America wants to go and Europe wants to go as well. And that's very dangerous indeed. If the Vice President was absolutely to underline that message that European security needs to be upgraded, which is absolutely something we can all agree with, why didn't he pan out those details? Use this platform to say what we all need to do. Instead, he did a grand tour of the states around Europe to tell us what's wrong and say that the threat is within. So I go back to Natalie's point that this could be a paradigm change in that relationship. And the only winner, I hope the panel would agree, if that is where we now go, will be our adversaries that will see us divided.
To be clear to Tobias, he wasn't here when I said you're not allowed to make a statement. But I think that was he came in a bit late, so he didn't hear me say you're only allowed to ask a question. But it's I think very helpful to get that that context and that correction, like we would do in the press. You have a little note and a correction to the Vice President's speech from 2 days ago. So another question from anybody? I have one, but yes, from the gentleman in the uniform.
Thank you, Lieutenant General Piotr Brazos. I'm currently the Eurocorps commander up in Strasbourg. First of all, I cannot agree more that there is a sense of urgency that we in Europe decide who are the main interlocutors on our side. This is absolutely crucial. The negotiations more or less start next week. So it's a really sense of urgency. But the question is, looking at the language of the Budapest Memorandum signed by Russia and 3 big countries, what can we do more, apart from what was already mentioned, to make sure that the new agreement is credible? Because what was written in the Budapest Memorandum about non-viability of borders, about sovereignty, about abstaining from the use of force, we're still going to have the same language, but now how we can add more credibility apart from the great idea, I think, on the NATO membership. Thank you.
So, yeah.
If I may pick up on this question, and refer to the Ukrainian member of the parliament, I think that the 16 packages of sanctions vis-à-vis Russia are an amazing development. I don't think we've ever had so many restrictive measures on anyone so strong and so often. Plus, there are legal proceedings about the frozen assets, especially in Belgium, because most of them are actually in Belgium. So there are steps being taken in that direction. I think mentioning the Budapest Memorandum is essential to understand the position of Ukrainians. Ukrainians were deceived once, basically abandoning their nuclear arsenal 30 years ago. They were deceived twice with non-implementation of the Minsk I and Minsk II. And if the current peace plan, ceasefire, or later on whatever the arrangement will be, will sanction the aggressor in positive terms getting more territory, they will be deceived 3 times. And this is, in my view, especially coming from a country that also had its territory occupied and which managed to get it back with combination of 2 methods. Method number 1, and occupied territories were there for 4.5 years and the remaining part for almost 7 years. We got it back when we managed to strike back when we were strong. The balance of power, very important point. That's why strengthening Ukraine in defense terms is something that should not be stopped. It is the essential ingredient. Otherwise, there is no chance to survive. And second point are the peace talks. There are examples on the European continent of peaceful reintegration of occupied territories. And I've been saying for a while, I'm very happy that Alex said it. I think in terms of methodology and the format, what we lacked on Ukraine in recent years was one personality, highly respected by everyone, taken into account in Moscow, taken into account in Kyiv, and having support in Washington and European capitals and other leaders, including the Global South, that could have the authority to manage the peace talks. We don't have the clarity. We had different formats. We had OSCE involved there. You know what was my favorite question to colleagues? I'm a former diplomat, so I used to ask them when the OSCE mission existed, apropos Helsinki in Ukraine. I used to ask them, who is the head of the OSCE mission? You know what was the answer? Nobody knew.
I'd like to nominate Wolfgang.
The visibility was lacking. We need a high visibility of someone strong who can manage the process.
We've only got a couple of minutes left. I have a question for all of you. I've been talking to a lot of industry, particularly in Germany, but across Europe, and some of the reaction I've heard is that America has abandoned us, or is in the process of abandoning us, and we need, as Europe, to look elsewhere, and China is the solution. I'm interested to hear from whoever would like to take that one, whether you think an alternative for Europe is a much closer relationship with China.
No.
Isn't that
come on,
interesting?
I mean, no. Let's come on.
The fact.
We've had a U.S. administration now for 3 weeks. And yes, we are looking at a shift. But to say that we are now abandoning a historic interest and value-based alliance to tilt towards China, I just think that whole question is absurd. Sorry.
Oh, thank God.
Anyone else like to weigh in on it?
Well,
The President of Finland just called me absurd.
No, this is journalistic twisting. I did not call you absurd. I called the question absurd.
Great honor. A great
but
honor.
Alex, headlines will go anyway that way. No, but on a serious note, no, I don't believe really that this is the kind of moment where we should really get into this mood. And let's face it, we are not going to get anything out of change of this kind of strategic paradigm. I really hope that we, again, at the end of this panel, that we stop sounding like, sorry to say, desperate housewives that are getting into the kind of...
Or house husbands.
Whatever. That we are getting into this kind of mood where we have not yet sorted out our own house, and we should. That we still, and I agree here, we have less than months since this administration is in the office, and indeed, taking into account with all the differences, with all what has been said about Vice President's speech or any other statements, believe me, the speech of the Chinese leader would be even much, much worse to deal with.
Thank you so much to my panel. It's been a great honor to be here with you. Prime Minister, President, thank you so much. Thank you to the audience for helping me with that, and see you next year.
So I think we're going to go back to the beginning of that.
Welcome to the stage, the chairman of the Munich Security Conference, Ambassador Christoph Heuschen.
Good morning, everyone. I see a few empty seats. I think 3 days of Munich conference have exhausted many. But I welcome everybody who has survived the last night's kicker cup of the Munich Security Conference, survived the fantastic dinner that the state of Bavaria was offering to the conference, but also the many very, very interesting discussions we had yesterday during the day. Today, on the last day, we want to concentrate on Europe, Europe in the world. We have heard a lot about the expectations on Europe and what Europe is supposed to do, and what is expected from it. So we'll talk today also about EU enlargement, EU competitiveness. We talk about a topic that has been on the agenda for many years, for too many years, and this is EU accession by the Balkan countries. We talk about new solutions in a polarized century. We will start with a discussion about Europe 50 years after Helsinki. And those who have lived through this, and I worked with Foreign Minister Genscher at the time, where so much hope was put on Helsinki that it would bring freedom, liberty, the right to choose its destination in Europe 50 years ago. And we are here 50 years later and wonder
Has Helsinki ended? Is it a moment, as Kaja Kallas last night said about Munich, are we living in a rerun of Munich 1938? These are questions, very important questions, questions we have to deal with. And I'm very happy that Jamil Anderlini from Politico will kick us off today. Thank you very much, and thanks for attending also this morning's conference.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm Jamil Anderlini. I am the Regional Director for Politico in Europe. I oversee all of our coverage in this part of the world. I'm really pleased, honored, grateful to be here to moderate this session. It's couldn't be more timely, couldn't be a more important moment. Every year I come to Munich Security Conference and the news is somewhat overwhelming. This year, no exception. I'd like to invite to the stage my panelists. Brilliant panel of Alexander Stubb, President of Finland first. Old friend. Edgar Zrinkovic is the President of Latvia. Kristian Frostadottir is the Prime Minister of Iceland, please. And Andrej Plenković is the Prime Minister of Croatia. One of the things I really enjoy about the Munich Security Conference is the audience participation and the ease with which I can moderate, because I can make you do at least half the work. But I will start off with asking some of my own questions to the panel. And once I turn it to the audience, I would just like to remind everyone, this is not the moment for grandstanding. This is not the moment for long speeches. This is the moment for questions. You have an amazing panel up here of world leaders, very important countries, small but important, mighty, small but mighty countries. And I would really encourage you, when it comes time for questions from the audience, to take advantage of this opportunity rather than take advantage to make a speech. That would be my request. Thank you very much. So we have here on the stage four of the more resolute members, I would argue, of NATO. I think, so in my career as a foreign correspondent, I always looked for the ambassadors of countries like Finland, Croatia, Iceland, and Latvia, because what I found about countries and ambassadors from these countries and the various places I've been posted is that they are always at the table, usually at the table, but they don't have to do the kind of grandstanding that I was mentioning earlier necessarily, because they are looking after the interests of their nation, but they can also observe and they can analyze in a way that isn't restricted in the way that some of the larger countries are. So I'm really very pleased to be here. We framed this panel around the Helsinki Final Act, which I have to be honest, I did have to ChatGPT a little bit and go back and really look through the history of this. It was before I was born, so let's just be clear. But I think that's a really interesting and valuable lens for us to look at the moment we're in now. From my understanding, maybe others are, I'm sure, more expert on the matter, but my understanding is it was seen as a win for the Soviet Union at the time, but laid the groundwork eventually for the fall of the Soviet Union. It was Gerald Ford and Leonid Brezhnev meeting in Helsinki. They both stayed in the hotel that we often go to every summer. There's a wonderful conference that President and I often attend in Helsinki, and they both stayed in that hotel. But I was sort of reflecting and thinking, God, isn't it amazing? We're in a moment where we're sort of nostalgic for Leonid Brezhnev. That we're thinking about Putin today and then Brezhnev then, and thinking, gosh, wouldn't it be perhaps great if we could go back to that sort of willingness to look to the West. What do you think that Helsinki Final Act, speaking as the President of Finland, has as a lesson for us today?
Well, there are many lessons, but let me begin. Finnish presidents don't very often quote communist leaders, but I think that Vladimir Lenin was more or less right when he said that there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. And going back to Christoph's point, is this sort of Munich 2.0? I don't think so. I actually think that the juxtaposition or the tension here is between two cities, Yalta and Helsinki. And of course, Yalta was pretty much exactly 80 years ago. And that was a carve-up by big powers, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union. So Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. And it was a European security structure based on spheres of interests. And of course, with that also, we ended up having the United Nations later on with the Security Council with 5 permanent members with a veto power. Now, I think the choice that we have today is between Yalta and Helsinki, because Helsinki was pretty much about 10 points, the way in which states should deal with each other, behave with each other, and also their citizens. I don't think the Soviets saw it as a victory for them at the time, but it was important to get them to the table. So my argument would be, of course, coming from a fairly small state with 1,340 kilometers of a border with an essentially imperialist power, that we should have more Helsinki and less Yalta, because I still believe that what was cemented in the UN and in Helsinki are the 3 key principles of statehood, which are independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. And right now we need to focus on that part, and I hope we could revive the spirit of Helsinki, which is 50 years old pretty much in August, but we'll see what happens. It's a big moment.
It is a big moment. Thank you. That's a wonderful way to frame it. We're at this moment choosing between Helsinki and Yalta. President, we've been listening to the Vice President of the United States here just 2 days ago, and then the responses from Germany and from other European countries, and the analysis that Politico journalists and others have been writing. If you were to analyze, based on the last couple of days, whether we're in a Yalta moment or a Helsinki moment, or what is more likely at the moment, what would you say?
Well, first of all, indeed, we are talking about 50 years of Helsinki, but actually it's also 80 years of Yalta. So it's a kind of interesting double anniversary in 2025. I just want to start to respond to one of your initial remarks and then to go to the question. You said that at some point one can probably feel nostalgic for Leonid Brezhnev. Frankly, in Latvia we do not feel nostalgic for Leonid Brezhnev, neither Mr. Putin nor anyone else. And you know, Helsinki had a real meaningful impact on the independence or so-called awakening movement back in Latvia, because our first human rights group that was fighting for independence of Latvia was established in 1986, and it was called Helsinki 86. So there is very, very strong affiliation for the spirit of Helsinki when it came to democracy, human rights. And indeed, probably at some point back in 1975, there was a feeling that this final act that has been signed in Helsinki was more to the benefit of the Soviet Union, because it was also talking about the borders that are not going to be changed. But then the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania were never recognized by the world as part of the Soviet Union. So where we are now, and what kind of moment? Frankly, I think that to some extent we simply, at this point, should cool down, to take a deep breath, to think about what has happened here. We do have a very emotional situation at this point, because indeed we see that there are very strong statements coming from the United States. we see that there are very strong statements coming also from some of our European friends and allies. We do understand that Germany is currently also in the final phase of elections, and we will see how it plays out next Sunday. But my advice at this point would be to concentrate more on what we should do. Unfortunately, since February 2022, we are talking a lot about the need to increase defense spending, to increase our defense capabilities. Many things have happened, but let's be frank, we are in a situation where our capabilities are not enough. And if we really want to be a serious partner for the United States or a serious challenger to Putin's ambitions, then it's about doing real things. I'm afraid that after a couple of days, after strong statements, we will somehow relax. We will relax again, and we will go back to the business as usual. So I do believe we need some time. We need to digest. But Munich is also good. I mean, this conference, and the city is good. Not what happened here in 1938. Munich is also good to have an open, honest conversation. Vice President Vance put his points. We should respond. I would say that my immediate response to freedom of the speech is yes. We in Latvia cherish very much freedom of the speech. But we also see that Russia is using information, migration, energy, and especially information as the weapon. And if you use this as the weapon, if you attack the very core of the country, if you doubt independence, if you want to get back to imperial ambitions, then of course we see this a bit differently. We are ready to talk about that, explain our point of view, and to engage in meaningful conversation. We'll see what's out of this.
Let's see if that works out for you. I hope it does. Prime
I
Minister,
hope they listen when he talks.
How would you see the speech by the Vice President coming as it does not long after, or in the middle of, rhetoric from the President of the United States about how Greenland should be part of the United States? Obviously, Iceland, if he zooms out a little bit and he starts to look more carefully, Iceland could look somewhat attractive to him as well. And I'm sorry, I don't want to give him any ideas. He's probably not watching.
I think we're live.
He's probably not watching. But if he is, I don't want to give him ideas. But is that why you are going to call for a referendum to join the European Union? Because you're worried about getting the Greenland treatment?
No. We are looking towards Europe. I mean, we are in Europe. We're part of the EEA. We've been an active part of Europe for a very long time. The discussion of Iceland joining the EU has been a relevant discussion for a long time. I think it's very important. I know there are some disagreements on this, how you frame EU accession, but I get this question a lot, especially after Sweden and Finland joined NATO. But I mean, NATO is a defense alliance. The EU isn't a defense alliance. It's a lot of things, and we're talking about security, and we need more security, but EU is an alliance of values, of politics, of policy, of finance, of economics. And I think it's very important that as Iceland looks towards the EU, that we don't scare people into joining an alliance of such. There is obviously some, real politics that needs to be involved. Iceland is aware of its security situation. We're aware of our position in the Arctic. We can't be naive about it. Security is something that has always been a sensitive topic in Iceland, if I'm just being frank with you. People are very proud of being, a non-military nation and showing that the Arctic can be a peaceful area. But we can't be naive about the fact that we are a peaceful nation because we're part of NATO. We have a bilateral defense agreement with the US. There are other people that are helping us with our defenses. And we are also very proud of our host nation capabilities. So there is a security angle. There will be a security angle. We are active in the dialogue on security within the EU, and I do think and support, and we officially support, all the measures that need to be taken in terms of security in the EU. But the question of EU accession in Iceland needs to be about identity, where you belong, who you want to trade with, which values you share, and it needs to be a progressive conversation as well. And I think, honestly, that's a good thing for the EU, because I think after the speech that we heard from the Vice President, we need to talk the EU up. We can't only be having discussions about how we're defending ourselves, but what are our values, that are people actually seeking to join those values. And so I would see it as a positive thing for the EU that a country like Iceland would be interested on those bases. But I mean, I appreciate the fact that you pointed out our situation south of Greenland, but I hope nobody else is watching.
Can I don't want to pick on you, I promise. Iceland is a founding member of NATO, but your percentage of GDP going on defense is zero because you have no standing army. Do you think that you are going to come under more pressure from the United States and from other NATO members when the question of 2% of GDP for defense is now 3%, is now 5%, is now whatever? So do you think that's something, and would you support remilitarizing Iceland?
It's really big questions. And I appreciate that you point out our 0%. It's good that everyone in here hears this. Listen, yes, on certain measures it is 0%. We have Keflavik Air Base. We participate actively in air policing. There are submarines that go through our waters. We are active in a lot of measures with NATO. We know we have important we are in an important situation. We have been positive towards increased infrastructure investments around the base, increased investments. So there are ways to look at this. From a political standpoint, it's clear, but also if I just speak on behalf of Icelanders, there has never been willingness among the Icelandic people to have an active military, and that's not going to change in the next few years. That does not mean we are not an important strategic partner. That does not mean that we are not going to be active in NATO, that we're going to be open to increased activities, that we will open our arms to, more surveillance in the area. But I think it's also important that there is a peaceful voice in that area as well, because we're hoping to keep the Arctic peaceful. But again, like I said, we're not naive towards the fact that there will be increased traffic in the area. We're opening up to that. And we're also revising our security strategies and our security policies. And my foreign minister has this in her ministry right now. I mean, this is a 6-week-old government. There's a lot that can happen in the next 4 years. This is a pro-NATO government. This is a pro-head of state, a pro-European government. So we're open to dialogue, and we will continue to push for increased NATO awareness in Iceland.
Thank you very much. Prime Minister, you live in a, let's say, complicated region, obviously. You also are part of a somewhat complicated coalition. You're, I understand, more of a centrist, but you've had to make a coalition with a party in particular that's a bit more to the right, shall we say? Topic of great interest and attention here in Germany at the moment. Does the rise of the far right, and others can weigh in if you feel like, but does the rise, I'm not picking on you either, does the rise of the far right in Europe complicate Europe's ability to defend itself? Since what we see with these extremist parties on the left and the right, they tend to be quite pro-Russian, quite pro-Chinese, quite pro-authoritarian. So do you feel that the rise of the far right, we don't have to specify your country, but across Europe, do you think it complicates the defense of Europe?
Well, unlike 6 weeks, I've been in office for 9 years. and this is my third government where we have different coalitions, but the dominant role is of the center-right and the EPP party, which is my party, HDZ, and nothing in terms of major policy lines has altered compared to the two previous governments. But you are right, the rise of the parties that have somehow seized the niche predominantly because of the fear of the European nation's population, of the illegal migration and its consequences on the security, on the way of life, on the changed societies, on everything that we have noticed here in Munich a few days ago, that we saw in Villach yesterday. This is a very big political space for parties who want to exploit it. At the same time, many of those parties, actually, when you look at their foreign policy narratives, are full of understanding for Moscow. It's almost horizontal. Here and there an exception, but this is a signal. To refer a little bit to your first point on Helsinki, I think Helsinki happened in a very different time. It happened in the time of détente. It included the human rights and democracy basket, which later on, I believe, helped also dismantling of the former communist regimes on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. And what we have seen is the very, from today's optics of Russia, very weak Russia in the 90s. And when you look at the Putin's posture, what's his main objective? His main objective is to, first of all, rectify the mistakes of the previous Russian leaders, which he doesn't see as time when Russia was strong. And when you look at this policy over time, gradually with different methods, the point was to come back to the sphere of influence. The point was to come back to the situation when he controls his neighborhood rather than someone else. And the example of Ukraine, where in 3 different years he had 3 different narratives. First year, it was a narrative that basically wanted to negate the existence of Ukrainians. He doesn't consider them as Ukrainians. He considers them as small Russians. The second year, it wasn't anymore Ukraine, it was NATO. In the third year, it was basically the New World Order, and that's what we are discussing today. This is actually the essential topic of Munich conference, of what was happening over the past few years. And the problem for international relations really starts when one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council starts to behave contrary to the international law and the international system that we have adhered to over the last 8 years. This is the fundamental problem that we are facing today, because UN is blocked, OSCE is a consensus-based organization blocked, and then what do you have? You have the confrontation.
I was just going to ask, maybe mildly facetiously, if you're talking about Russia or the United States. But I'd like to throw it to all of you to ask what you think the chances are of a ceasefire, and what you think the terms are going to be of that ceasefire. Probably with you, starting with you.
Sure. I mean, I kind of tried to frame the package into a 3-phase process. The first phase is the pre-negotiation. And this is the moment when we need to rearm Ukraine and put maximum pressure on Russia, which means sanctions, which means frozen assets, so that Ukraine begins these negotiations from a position of strength. And this is also the moment, and I think the Americans are absolutely spot on this, when we start looking at interim security arrangements in Ukraine. This phase, we don't know how long it's going to exist, how long it's going to take, but it's going to be a while. Phase number 2, and we're not there yet, is a ceasefire. And the ceasefire is quite often mixed up with a peace process. They're 2 completely separate things. A ceasefire basically means that you do a demarcation of a border or contact line, and that line is then monitored. It can be the OSCE, it can be the UN. These are not peacekeepers, it's just regular international monitoring. And then after that, during the actual ceasefire, you start looking at the agenda and the modalities of the actual peace negotiations. And this could take a while. You do some
confidence-building measures. It could be an exchange of prisoners. It could be handing over the kidnapped children. It could be something about sanctions. But this is very much a moment when there needs to be a system to maintain the ceasefire. For that, I would argue that it's a Ukrainian, European, and American endeavor. In other words, the Ukrainians take the lead. Europe does the support, and the United States is a backstop. I've heard from a lot of senators here during this week an excellent idea, and the idea is that if Russia ever were to attack Ukraine again, that's when NATO membership would materialize and NATO would come back in. That is the ultimate backstop and deterrent for the situation. But we're not there yet. Then we come to the third part of it, which is the actual peace negotiations. They will probably take a long time, but that is the moment when you start discussing more complicated issues, probably such as territory, security, compensation, reconstruction, etc., etc. But I stress that this is just a linear way of looking at it, and we have many more urgent things. I just want to finish with one final remark on this. There are two things that are non-negotiable. One of them is EU membership and NATO membership of Ukraine. That is a decision for the Ukrainians. The EU process is ongoing. Ukraine will become European, not Russian. And this is already a big loss, I think, for Putin. And the other one is NATO membership at some stage. The other thing that we should not discuss is what we're discussing here today, is new European security arrangements. There's no way in which we should open the door for this Russian fantasy of a new indivisible security order where you can do spheres of interest. And here's where I come to the absolutely final point, and that is, I think in this war, the three fundamental questions for Ukraine are independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. In World War II, Finland maintained independence. We lost sovereignty to decide which organizations we wanted to be in. And then we lost 10% of our territory, including the areas where my grandparents and my father was born. Let's just make sure that at the end of this process, we don't have that predicament for Ukraine. That's what we're working for.